My home is where I want to grow old.
My home means everything to me.
My home is the heart of the family.
Home is beautifully designed.
My home is warm.
My home is where I feel safe.
My home is a place to build memories.
My home is healthy.
My house is carbon neutral.
My home is accessible.
My home is affordable.
My home is where I feel relaxed.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the session that we're doing, Anthony Collins is doing with Alan Cavill from Blackpool Council. This session is focused on how you can deliver more through working together, and we were primarily looking at the role of housing in terms of regenerating town centres. I'm Owen Brown. I'm a partner in Anthony Collins, where I lead the local government team. Alan Cavill is a director at Blackpool Council, and my colleague Mark Cook is a partner in our commercial team, also working a lot with local authorities and housing associations. I'm just going to give a brief introduction now into the sort of issues that we're going to be covering today. We are going to allow some time for questions at the end, and we will be really pleased to answer as many questions as come in. And you've got our contact details on one of the slides that will come up. And so if there are any issues that you want to cover in more detail that we haven't been able to look at in the sessions, please do contact us, and we'll be very, very pleased to speak to you and discuss those issues that you have. So this is really looking at how partners, primarily in this sense, local authorities and housing associations, can come together to produce regeneration across town and city centres. It's something that has been looked at for a while. It's been known for quite some time that housing is a key factor in regenerating those areas. And of course, the COVID crisis has really accelerated that with the downturn in retail and the lack of footfall in city and town centres. And so is there a way in which, by working together, by setting up joint ventures or other vehicles, local authorities can achieve with their housing sector partners a mixed use economy across those town centres, which brings in affordable and social housing as well as market housing, and which adds in to retail and other business activities to create a really thriving regenerated town centre. I'm not talking, and we're not going to be talking here about the conversion of shops and offices into housing, although that can play a part, particularly if it's done well. And we've seen some good and some, frankly, fairly appalling examples of where that hasn't gone so well. But it's more about really a planned approach to deliver those aims of a council's corporate strategy and of the aims of the housing associations as well. Usually, of course, these don't just focus on delivering housing for a local authority, they deliver on how you can deliver aspects of housing, of employment, creating more jobs, of environmental improvement. And we know that there are massive issues in relation to, for example, public health, which can be helped through environmental improvements and not helped if environmental improvements don't happen. And also education as well. So if you're looking at what you can create and regenerating a town centre, you're really going to be looking at that whole package. And all of that is what is normally within a local authority's aims in their corporate strategy to achieve really effective regeneration. It's not just about bringing people into the town centre, it's about bringing people in properly to the town centre and have something which is regenerated and which is sustainable. Something which will grow, something which offers a vibrant part of a town. And so what's central to this is actually how can you make this happen? What are the things that you need to do to achieve something together? And so Mark's going to be looking at this in terms of what our experience is when we've set up joint ventures between housing associations and local authorities, and what needs to be sorted out at the start. I always say that if you can't sort it out at the start when you're getting on, then you're hardly likely to be able to sort it out very effectively when you're not getting on if things fall apart. These are things like, what's your risk profile? Do you have the same attitude to risk? What do you want to achieve in terms of the return? Is this about a financial return, or is this about something more? This is about achieving sustainable, social, affordable, market rent housing, which contributes to the economy of the whole area. And Alan's also going to be looking at some of the barriers that he's found to effective joint working and how you can really develop a simple but effective approach between the partners, which will help to deliver. And one of the things that we'll also have to accept is timing. You can't regenerate something overnight. We all know that. But of course, politicians, local authorities, national politics, that all works on the election timetable. And we know that when elections come up, politicians of all flavours do want to see results. And sometimes that means that longer term projects actually don't really have to be pushed by all parties to be able to be achieving what they want to achieve in something that isn't going to happen within the normal 4-year or 5-year electoral cycle. So Mark's going to be dealing with in detail on some of his experience that we've had in dealing with those joint ventures. Alan's going to be talking about his own experience and what is happening in Blackpool, which is, I think, a really, really interesting place at the moment. And then we're going to allow plenty of time for questions. So please put those questions in. Those will come up. We'll try and answer those at the end. So that's probably enough from me as an introduction. And I'm now going to pass over to Alan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olwyn. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And yeah, I suppose I'm going to talk about my experience in Blackpool, and I would like really sort of 2 points to come out of this really. One is that all housing markets are different, and whilst you might think, well, okay, so why are we all sat here trying to do best practice? I suppose that means that everyone has a little piece of somebody else's answer, and I think we can all learn from that. So it might not be that the things that we do in Blackpool could be exactly replicated wherever you are, but actually some small parts of the things that we do could be replicated where you are, and similarly some of the things that you do could be replicated in Blackpool. So if a quick look at Blackpool's housing supply, then you know, it's slightly unusual in the sense that we've got about 5,000 local authority stock, which is about 8% of the total. We've got about 4% of the other social housing stock, mostly housing associations. But what we do have is a 25% private rented sector, which is growing, and a privately owned stock, which is falling. Perhaps not quite as usual as some other places. And how that's come about is pretty important to Blackpool. And I suppose people do understand how perhaps some areas are driven by their past, and so, for instance, mills and mill workers' cottages might be something that people are used to and understand. In actual fact, Blackpool's housing problems, and the reason why they relate to the town centre, is because what we're talking about here is a private rented sector which is almost entirely made up of former guest houses that have slipped from that use. Without necessarily having planning, but by avoiding lots of planning, the planning process, have slipped from that use into a residential use, and unfortunately not in a good way. So a lot of these properties were perhaps normal family homes that were 3-4 bedrooms. They'd been subdivided because they happened to be near the train station or near the town centre, and somebody realised they could let rooms out, and they might become 11-bedroom guest houses. And of course, once that business has failed, that there are 2 choices. One is you could convert it back to a family home, but that means you've got to spend money on doing it, or you could just take advantage of those 11 bedrooms and rent them out using housing benefit as your basis, and get a fantastic return on investment. And that's what's happened in Blackpool. So we have lots of absentee landlords. I think the Daily Telegraph was quoting at the beginning of last year that Blackpool was one of the best places to invest in properties, because you could get a 20% return on investment by buying up one of these guest houses and renting them out to all and sundry. So great, we've got an oversupply of housing, not like the rest of the country. Part of our problem is that in terms of policy, what we want to do is get rid of homes, not create them, or certainly not create any more of the similar sort of quality that we've got now. So the problem with this is that these are very, very poor quality properties. We've got absentee landlords who don't want to invest. Why should they invest? Housing benefits paying them whether they invest or not. They're never going to get much more rent than housing benefit pays anyway. It's a natural attractor, a sink for people who can't find housing elsewhere. So we have on average something like 35,000 change of use on housing benefit, change of use forms on housing benefit each year. And that represents anywhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people moving into the town. Now we don't grow by 6,000 or 8,000 people a year, so that means that 6,000 or 8,000 people are moving out of the town as well. So there's this massive churn of people right adjacent to the town centre, which drives all sorts of social problems, as you can probably imagine. These are not generally people who are coming with lots of money in their pockets and a job. They're coming with lots of difficulties and lots of problems that we try and help them, and all of the services try and help them to resolve. But the problem is that what they're doing is failing into Blackpool, and then if we put them back together and they have get a better life, then they succeed out. So we don't want to live in those areas that they've moved into previously. I hope I painted a nasty enough picture for you, and realise how perhaps slightly different things are in Blackpool compared to other localities. But what we have done is we've used every tool that we possibly could. So where we do have development sites, and one of the problems Blackpool has is that it's a fairly small place. It's one of the most densely developed areas in the country outside of London. And consequently, we don't have greenfield sites or even brownfield sites, come to that. What we have is developed sites that need to be bought up and demolished, so site assembly is difficult. We have a few sites on the outskirts of town, and what we do that's slightly different is we don't insist on a social mix within those developments. We try and get a contribution to help with the central stock and thereby work with the private sector on that. We have had experience of working very, very well with a lot of social landlords, RSLs and so on, and with some success, but the conversion costs are eye-watering. And if you take one of these guest houses, yes, you can pick it up pretty cheap, but if you're converting it back to, say, a family home, it might have cost you 80, 100,000 pounds to buy. It might cost you 80 or 100,000 pounds to convert it, and then when you finish, it's worth 80 or 100,000 pounds. So the economics doesn't really stack up, and it makes it difficult in the days of the current grant regime to make that stack up from a social housing point of view. But we do work well with social landlords, and they have helped us with developments in the town centre. We've got some really good examples of that, really good examples of where we've worked with RSLs to deliver really good quality new housing on brownfield sites in not far from the town centre. But our most difficult stock is this sort of morass of private rented multi-ownership stock. And I think we found the only way of dealing with that was to get in the game ourselves. So we've created the Blackpool Housing Company, which has a target of producing 100 units a year. That created back end of 2015. We're at 443 units now. So if it wouldn't have been for COVID, we would have been hitting our 500 target by the end of year 5. And that is a very tight model. And Owen talked about risk. And I think we really need to understand, if we're going to solve these problems, that local authorities and others have to take the sort of risks that perhaps the private sector wouldn't even come anywhere near. So this is I've explained the finance of this. The only reason this works is because we can borrow money so cheaply. We're making on average a 4% return on these properties, and that includes that has to cover all of our running costs and everything else. We spent so far about 30 million quid on doing up properties. And of course, one of the reasons why we struggle to get any support from central government is what we're doing is reducing the number of properties in the town. not increasing it. So that 443 probably represents something like 1,200 guest house rooms that we've bought up in order to reduce the 443. So that's a massive scamper through our problems. And as I say, they won't be the same as anybody else's, but there will be lessons that can be learnt there. And I'm sure there are lessons that we could learn from other people. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Alan. Can we move on now to Mark?
Well, hello everybody. As you can see, I'm wearing my suit jacket for the very first time since March this year. You are honoured viewers in that regard, that I should spruce up for this occasion. If I can run through to the third slide, that will be the basis for my thoughts. Brilliant. We've been involved at Anthony Collins in joint ventures involving housing associations and community-based organisations and developers, really getting on for 30 years, really. And certainly when people tried to recruit me to join Anthony Collins, which was about 25 years ago, I was given a grand tour of an estate being developed sort of near to Acox Green by the relevant partner at the time, Martin Knox, who was very much responsible for us actually developing our practice with local authorities and with housing, and was very much a pioneer in this area. And that was the area now known as Stockfield, basically, which was a joint venture which involved Birmingham City Council, a community-based organisation, a registered provider, and the banks lending into it, basically. Those circumstances were quite different in those days, but nevertheless, what we have got there is one of two very successful projects in Birmingham, where it's community-led, with housing association partners on an ongoing basis, the other one being Witton Lodge. So I got shown around, and I must say, 25 years ago when I was shown around, that was not enough. Not even Harry Ramsden's Fish and Chips was enough to persuade me to join Anthony Collins. About 2 years later, I did join Anthony Collins because I was ready to do so and up for the challenge about how do we deliver projects benefiting communities on the side of the communities. And I have been there ever since in 23 years. And since then, I've certainly seen a number of projects involving Housing Action Trust, as they were at the time, local authorities and housing associations working together, and more recently creating joint venture vehicles between housing associations and local authorities, typically a limited liability partnership, which enables not just one project to be undertaken, but actually a stream of projects picking out sites in different areas. And an example would be the project which we helped kick off, a joint venture vehicle between Watford Council and Watford Community Housing Trust, which involved two vehicles, the first vehicle being a developer limited liability partnership, and the second one being a housing a company jointly owned by those two entities for managing housing, particularly housing which might be pertaining to more of a market rent basis. But a starting point, which I would say is very, very important, is that each organisation, whether it's a private developer or a housing association or a local authority, must optimise its own structural flexibility to deliver what it can by itself, so that it can then optimise what it can do together with a partner organisation. And that is something which Blackpool, Council very much have done, as Anna refers to. They've had for many years an ALMO managing its housing stock, and that's Blackpool Coastal Homes. And they also have this private landlord organisation which they own, which is called the Blackpool Housing Company. And recently, in order to lever in more funding, they have set up as a subsidiary of the private landlord, a registered provider, Lumen, which is looking to attract more resources and make a wider range of tenures available within the purview of the council. And that's something which we're again looking at with other housing associations and the local authorities, in particular local authorities which may have different drivers. It's very important that the registered provider, which was established as not-for-profit for Blackpool, but there are other councils which are looking to establish for-profit registered providers within their structures as well, and we've been working on those as examples. Housing associations, of course, and registered providers are very much used to establishing their own structures for delivering as much as they can in way of development. Typically, they might have what's called a DevCo, development company, which enables more effective VAT recovery, but also an outward-looking development company, usually known as a PropCo, to actually build and sell market sale properties. And that enables a whole range of things to be achieved. One is tax efficiency, but more importantly, regulatory compliance. So you can have data clarity over investments which are either pure investments or those which are purely for charitable purposes, but more complex, how you deal with what might be called mixed purpose investments in that regard. And when those two organizations get together with their own company structures to flexibly engage with each other, rather like Watford did, then you can actually create a joint venture vehicle, which is actually between the companies sometimes, rather than just directly from the local authority, in order to be able to pursue joint schemes. One might ask, what are they looking from each other in that regard? And some organizations have land, organizations have funding, other people have development expertise, particularly in areas where the local authority has transferred its stock some years ago. Working with its housing association partner, which took the stock, is a very good thing. There's a whole range of reasons why they might want to do so. In choosing the right joint venture structures, there's a whole spectrum of ways of dealing with things, starting off with a simple land transfer. You know, one organization might transfer land to the other for appropriate consideration, and then the other one actually develops it, but very much in accordance with recognizing the policy it aims, if not the detailed specification of what the other organization is about. And the reason why we have to be careful in that regard is that both registered providers and local authorities are contracting authorities for the purposes of the European procurement rules. And in that sense, it's important to ensure that we create structures which both enable compliance with the procurement rules, but also maximize flexibilities where a structure is taken which means that the actual delivery of the project may not itself be subject to those detailed rules. So typically, when you establish a joint venture vehicle, one of the key considerations is, will that itself be a contracting authority for the purpose of delivering projects? And that is something which will depend on the aspirations and intentions of those joint venture partners on a case-by-case situation. In some places, it's acting purely commercially, and therefore you can say that it is not a contracting authorities. But in other areas where they are achieving strong policy aims, we've certainly been advising that it would be best to treat that vehicle also as a contracting authority in order to be very, very clear about things, particularly as actually compliance with procurement rules is not the bind which some people imagine them to be, and possibly actually demonstrate the ability to demonstrate accountability, transparency, and good quality in terms of a due process, which otherwise would have to be replicated by some other way. Then you have the other side of the spectrum, joint venture entities, which are established. The main options tend to be a joint venture company to buy shares or a limited liability partnership. I have had discussions with local authorities where their discussion has been, what about thinking about something which is less used nowadays, a limited partnership. That was very much used in the days before housing associations and local authorities had available limited liability partnerships, and often involved a sleeping partner which would be there alongside more active partners. Those kinds of structures were certainly established a number of years ago, but in undoing them, they can be quite complicated, and therefore they don't tend to be what's considered. But limited liability partnerships are very much familiar, and the thing about them is that the member of those two organizations, they're not like companies. You appoint directors, they owe their first duty to the company, whereas the two members, or more members than that, of that entity, they are there acting in good faith with each other as partners, but they principally are responsible back to their own organizations in terms of accountability. There is, unless you write it into the partnership deed, a duty to actually act in good faith in relation to that organization and replicate the legislation which Companies House would otherwise require for companies, then the assumption is that their first responsibility is back to that organisation. So governance can be a lot closer with limited liability partnerships structured in the right ways. And tax can be a very relevant factor. Certainly, one project which we were looking at down in London involving a London borough and a local housing stock transfer landlord, one of the reasons for dealing with the regeneration of a neighbourhood using a joint venture entity is because VAT would flow in more effective ways. Now, I should come out now and say that about 30 years ago, I was actually a tax lawyer before I saw the light and became a public sector commercial lawyer. So it's important to know the questions, but also to get the right advice with tax people and make sure that structures are dealt with at the right time. So when Owen talks about getting things right at the outset, it's not just getting an understanding of each party's governance requirements, but also the appropriate tax structure so that what is implemented down the line is something which will work on a continual day-to-day basis in a way which is effective and maximizes resources. Not that tax should be the driver, because that would be inappropriate. But nevertheless, it's an important aspect in that regard. So key legal factors, I've already mentioned procurement. I will also mention governance, both in terms of registered providers and their regulated regime, but also local government and local authorities and the law which applies to them, particularly the duties to achieve the best consideration they can in relation to sites which they dispose of, which is a duty under section 123 of the Local Government Act 1972, which is relates to land held in the general fund, but where they still held land in the housing revenue account, that's dealt with under the Housing Act 1985. So there are two regimes there, two sets of general consents to become familiar with, so you need to look at that and work your way through. State aid is relevant in spite of Boris's best efforts to make sure that we have a different regime from next year. Who knows what will happen with the internal markets bill, which is coming out tomorrow. But nevertheless, the having regard to understanding how the land is applied, how it's used, and how you restructure projects from a state aid perspective is very important. And certainly we're seeing a lot of requests to provide state aid advice in these times, not just in terms of housing and regeneration, but also in terms of the wide range of projects which the government is seeking to fund to be able to kickstart the revival in this country of the economy in the light of COVID-19. There are provisions about how you improve local infrastructure, for example, something called Article 56, which I've become very familiar with, and which I think will see more attention when we see streams of funding coming in, not only from a local authority, but also directly from central government via Homes England and other agencies. Local LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, for example. Funding is very, very important, and Alan talked about the low cost of funding in terms of funding provided to projects by the local authority. Obviously, because he's dealing with a situation which reflects a social need, then you're able to do so on the basis where there might not be social housing markets, because you're looking to slim down the market, not the other way around, and therefore state aid issues should be less present. But nevertheless, being very, very clear in a joint venture where funding is provided by the housing association, then there's less of an issue. There's more an issue with its own funders, making sure that the consents are there, that the actual funding terms allow either equity be put in and or loan funding. And to be frank, you have to look at each housing association's requirements in that regard, each registered provider's funding documents on a case-by-case basis. But from a local authority's perspective, making sure that any funding it provides in is done so on market terms, having reference to interest rates which are published by the European Commission at this moment in time, in order to benchmark that there is no state aid there. One key issue is, of course, there are then going to be the nuts and bolts of what you do with site-by-site development. And this actually is something, having dealt with all the high-level issues and structure, which I tend to get engaged with, my colleagues which deal with property and regeneration, they are the key people to be involved in terms of site development. Is the site a good site? Is it clean? Does it have planning permission? Are there remediation issues? Who takes the risk on those issues in terms of taking them forwards? Are there particular things which need to be developed and taken forwards where we accept that there will be public subsidy in order to bring a site back into use? And what that is, it means that we have to processes and standard documents in a project which enable those things to be followed through on a consistent basis, on a basis which actually enables a good flow through of projects on an ongoing front. In that connection, therefore, ignoring those issues in terms of what actually do the sites entail is something which you should not leave to the last minute. Unfortunately, and some of my property colleagues do actually complain about this, they don't actually look at those issues or not ask my clients to do so early enough in the process. And you would expect me to say this, but when you've got a project, please bring in your lawyers as early as possible into the situation so that we can give some headline advice, make sure that the ground is laid for a successful project, even if then our tools are put down whilst the business planning happens and we are asked to actually engage with things down the line. And then my final box, you will see that I have been going anti-clockwise, is all about business cases and project management. This might not be a legal issue, but for me, this is very, very important, really, which is projects do not have momentum unless you have clearly identified project managers acting for both the joint venture, but also leading from each of the two organizations involved in order to drive through progress. And so many times projects are stalled because nobody's actually driving and checking on the momentum, that the actions which were agreed last time actually have been implemented. And so we can get hiatus. And I think agreeing up front how managed and seen through and who those project sponsors are is very, very important. And developing the business case for that initiative is vital. And particularly as in the terms of the joint venture entities to create, having regard to a business plan which is prepared for the sites in question and for the ongoing business is vital, because from a governance perspective, if we agree the business plan up front, those who actually then operate the joint venture or the initiative on a day-to-day basis, they will actually have free rein to actually engage within the terms of that business plan without going back up to the members of the organization, because that's their remit. It's only things which are outside that they would then go back up to, and that enables quick progress of a project. But good governance requires that people should at least upfront approve the parameters within which the project is going to proceed to take it forwards. And so that is a quick canter, a very quick canter, and I know I talk too fast, through the whole range of issues which you have to address at this time, but hopefully that enables you all to have a few questions to ask to excite the conversation further. Thank you, Olwen.
Thank you very much, Mark. If it's coming back to me, yeah, and thank you, Alan. That was really helpful. I don't think we've had any questions yet, so we might have to make some of our own. But I just wanted to pick up, Mark, on that point you made about project management and how important it is, because I couldn't agree more. But I think also, particularly when you're looking at larger scale projects, and the regeneration of a town centre obviously has to be one of those. I can remember several lives ago looking at various projects that were taking place and looking at where funding should be given on a regional basis when we have the regional word. And one of the things that really made a difference toward about the delivery of a project is how much that project was then tied into what the council wanted to achieve as a whole. If it was something which was a project and seen that, you go off and deal with it with housing and don't bother the corporate ethos of the council anymore, it was far less likely to be delivered on time and within budget and effectively as when it was really tied into what the council wanted to achieve as a whole. And I think that's quite an important point, really, in terms of, you do need good project managers, you do need people who understand the project, but really, if this is something that is important to the authority, it's something that needs to have a place at the top table. I don't know if either of you want to come back on that, or indeed on any of the other points that we made in the session.
If I could, Olwen, just to back up the point on project management. I mean, I think it's despite the difficult times that local authorities find themselves in, we about 3 years ago created something called the Growth and Prosperity Team, which is actually a team of project managers. And they look after all of the major capital projects, be they housing or other forms of regeneration across the council. against a wider plan, which is monitored both by our corporate leadership team and by the executive, and which gets reported on, all the time, pretty much, with various targets associated with it. So it's absolutely top to bottom linked to everything that we're trying to achieve. But that's most importantly, we felt it was really critical to buy in the services of professional project managers who really could make sure that things run along, because it's all right people like me running around with their thingies on fire and trying to make projects work, but it's just plate spinning and it doesn't work. And I'd be the first to admit that.
Yeah, I think you need them both, don't you? You need that expertise in project management, and you need it tied into what you want to achieve as an authority overall. I think that both of those are essential to really make sure that projects do get delivered. I'm interested, actually, Alan, just to look at what you felt some of the biggest barriers had been in terms of what you want to achieve, what Blackpool wants to achieve as a town overall.
Yeah, I guess, crikey, where would I start? I mean, the finance one I've already mentioned, in the sense that unfortunately things we want to do don't quite stack up, and that therein comes the risk. But I suppose some of the biggest issues for me have been that government departments all want slightly different things from us, and consequently, it's hard to. I mean, the department we all get on best with is probably MHCLG, because they sort of get us, and they have to. But I hope there's nobody on from DWP. But if there is, I'll apologise in advance. But working with DWP and trying to get them to understand that effectively it's housing benefit that's funding the problems in Blackpool has been really, really difficult. And then trying to get them to consider the possibility of having a separate system for one locality, or not having a homogenous system for the whole of the UK is, England, has been, well, it's not been difficult, it's been impossible. So, we've had to give up on that route. There is a route that says if you could sort out housing benefit in Blackpool, you could solve a lot of the problems that it creates. But actually, the only route that we feel we can go down with government is to say, give us shed loads of money and we'll knock stuff down. And whilst that'll work as well, it's odd that we can't look at the route that actually saves Treasury money and achieves the same thing. But I do understand it's difficult, because we have a very centralised system of government that doesn't allow for any differences to occur anywhere. Certainly not in England, and slightly more so or less so in the devolved nations.
Okay, that's really thanks, Alan. I think that's really, really interesting. We've had a question come through from Kieran Wilson. Thank you, Kieran. What's the biggest challenge in making a JV successful and managing the relationship? Really good question. I think central to what we've been talking about. So I don't know. Alan, do you want to start? And maybe I'll bring Mark in.
Yes.
Yeah, if I can. I suppose we've got a number of JVs, and I guess the most important thing to understand from the beginning is what everybody's seeking to get out of that particular joint venture. Yeah. Because if you lose sight of that, sometimes you end up arguing with people, and they're thinking, well, I told you I was going to make a profit from the beginning. Why is it a problem now? Yeah. And I suppose as a local authority that sometimes gets a bit frustrating. But if you try and remember why each party is there, I mean, we're all there to do something good, hopefully. But we all have slightly different drivers in terms of what we're seeking to achieve, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. I mean, it's it's important that we all come from different sectors, and we all have a slightly different point of view of the world, and we've got different paymasters who are sitting on our backs and making sure we do what they're asking us to do. So I think that's been probably one of the biggest frustrations, which you can avoid if you just try and remember that.
Yeah. Mark, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I'd agree with Alan, in as much as I think it's important not only to be clear at the outset, but to keep communicating with each other. So obviously regular governance and board meetings are important, or liaison forum organisations are important, but also the willingness to keep actually translating yourself to the other partner so that they understand, because people come and go in organisations, and sometimes people can forget why the original joint venture or collaboration was established. Some of the people who would have set them up will have been sort of entrepreneurs, starters of initiatives, and then they will have been succeeded by colleagues who are actually left with maintaining things. So understanding why it is being achieved, but also then keeping explaining what's going on and regularly communicating is absolutely vital in that regard. And it does depend on people, I have to say, at times. You know, I'm involved with some very interesting joint ventures and collaborations at the moment where everybody's on the same page, but you can bring the totality of the skills and attitudes there. So some people are very driven to delivery, other people are actually still trying to grapple with the bigger picture and taking things forward. But nevertheless, it is absolutely critical to bring forward those people and keep talking and maintaining communications, and not to impose on the other organisation a particular perspective, with making sure they're really understanding what's going on. And that's vital in terms of the broad picture which you talked about, Olwen, in terms of understanding the corporate objectives of the local authority and what it's seeking to achieve in the round, because actually what may be required, I've been looking at a joint venture, for example, which one district council was looking to host for its housing, looking for joint venture partners, and its main driver was that by creating its own development partner organisation, it would be able to deliver more housing itself, which was in accordance with its own development plan, and therefore would be a major player in that area. So what is the particular driver each time is very important. Complexities and then recording accurately what's agreed is also vital in that connection, and also anticipating what will happen, what will go wrong, and how you're going to come out of it. That has to be addressed properly at the outset, and not just sort of leaving it to some blind hope and trust that it will be resolved on the basis of relationship at that point in time, because I can say that economic pressures on each entity may mean that those relational behaviours may fall out of the window if we haven't set them up properly at the outset.
Okay, that's really interesting. I agree with all of that. I've had another question in, going back to somewhere which something which was very popular a few years ago. And someone has asked, I don't know who Ryan Fairbairn, thank you, Ryan. I'm interested to hear, Ryan asked, what the panel's view of using local asset-backed vehicles as a joint venture structure. Now, this was something which was really a very popular thing about, I don't know, 8-9 years ago, something like that. It's dropped out really in recent years, but there's no reason why it can't be done. What do you think, Mark?
So the practice at the time was to identify particular sites, which would then go into the joint venture and the vehicle, and then would be developed in accordance with the programme. I have to say I prefer a slightly different model, which is to establish the governance and then to think about how you bring in sites on a case-by-case basis in accordance with the business plan, because that allows for greater flexibility. And some of the things which were established early on in terms of LABVs actually have been very successful in delivery, but others got stuck because they basically identified a set of properties, and when they got stuck with the actual delivery issues around them, the momentum was lost. It would be better, in my view, to create joint venture vehicles which actually have bite-sized trucks, which can be achieved on a case-by-case basis, because that gives people a sense of hope that actually something will work that way. And from that perspective, I like joint venture vehicles which chew off a small bit at a time rather than a massive portfolio in one go.
Yeah. Alan, anything you want to add to that?
Not really. It's not something we've ventured into. I think for us, I guess the risk to property prices locally and so on has meant that that most people have shied away from that sort of long-term approach to things in Blackpool. But and hence going back to the point about the local authority having to take the risk, really. So
and that point about flexibility, I think that Mark made, is really important as well, isn't it? That you want to be able to, you've got to keep, I think, your perspective on what you set out to achieve. And keeping your perspective on that, and everything that you're doing, is that going to be something which will assist in achieving that objective or not? Because it's very easy sometimes to get sidetracked into interesting things which might sound fantastic. Alan, you look as though you wanted to.
Sorry, yeah, I should have said. I mean, I suppose there is one aspect that could change that. I mean, one of the things that stops an asset-based vehicle proceeding very often, in our view is that we can borrow money so cheaply that it doesn't make sense to use that source of funding. If the Treasury continues to get their collywobbles about local authorities borrowing loads of money in that way, then I guess it could come back into the fore as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And of course, the Treasury has moved back and forth and made all sorts of noises about restricting local authorities' ability to borrow money cheaply and what it can then use that money on. And, you know, who knows as to whether or not that will continue or not. Right, I think, folks, that we are just about out of time. I'd very much like to thank everybody for their questions, and Alan particularly, and Mark for your contributions. I think we can wrap it up here, and that's been a really interesting session. So thank you very much.